All right, so we talked the past couple of lab sessions, and we discussed it. When we go over the skeleton, we decided to break it down into regional anatomy, appendicular and axial. So we just concluded with the axial. If you recall, the axial skeleton is made up of the skull, all right, the vertebrae or the spine, and also the thoracic cage. But we didn't include, all right, a couple other bones in that because that's part of the appendicular skeleton. So how I tell folks to remember the appendicular skeleton is to pretty much think of it as the upper and lower extremity and the bones to which they connect to or articulate with. So we're going to start off talking about the upper extremities. So for the appendicular skeleton, all right, for the upper extremities, we are going to discuss what we call the pectoral girdle, all right? And the pectoral girdle is basically your collarbone, which is the clavicle, and your shoulder blade, which is the scapula. So I'm no longer going to refer to your shoulder blade as the shoulder blade. I'm going to refer to it as the scapula. Same thing with the collarbone. I'm going to refer to the collarbone as the clavicle, all right? So your upper extremity is going to articulate, all right, with the scapula, and then the clavicle will articulate with the scapula also, and that's going to form what we call the pectoral girdle. And basically what it does is that supports your arms, okay? And believe it or not, this is crazy. I love this statistic here. It's not even in the slideshow here. But the clavicle is the only bony articulation for your upper extremity. What that means is, if you look at it bone-wise, the clavicle here, all right, attaches, yes, to the scapula, okay? The scapula does not attach to anything on the axial skeleton. It just sits on the back of the ribs there. There's muscles on the back of the ribs, and the scapula kind of floats around on top. It doesn't have a bony articulation with the axial skeleton. So the only bony articulation is this guy right here. And that's your collarbone. So it's an S-shaped bone. So I used to think it's a long bone, but it's not. All right? And so it's going to articulate with the manubrium, which is that part of the sternum or the breastbone. Okay, that kind of a rhomboid-shaped bone. Kind of looks like this. All right, then the body of the sternum drops down. Okay. So it's going to articulate on each side, one here and one here for the other collarbone, or clavicle, excuse me. All right, and remember what we call this little space in between? It's like a notch, jugular notch, all right, suprasternal notch or sternal notch, okay? So then the clavicle extends all the way back and it articulates with the scapula, but specifically this structure here, which is called the acromion. And the acromion is a process that comes off of the scapula. Okay, so when we're discussing the clavicle, there are two ends to it. Okay, you have the sternal end, obviously, that's going to be the end that we just talked about that articulates with the manubrium. All right, and that forms the sternoclavicular joint. Some people get a lot of popping in that joint, and that's because the joint's not tracking right. So that part of the clavicle looks triangular or pyramidal, kind of like that. Okay, the acromion, the acromial end, that makes me think of a spoon. All right, it's broad, it's flattened. Right, it articulates with the acromion or the acromial process on the scapula. So it forms, most commonly people have referred to it as the AC joint. You may have heard of that, okay, but it stands for the acromioclavicular joint. All right, so let's take a peek and see what the clavicle looks like right here. Okay, so here you go. Here's your S-shaped curvature here of the bone. All right, so you have the flattened, broad end here. That's the acromial end. That's going to articulate with the clavicle, with the scapula, excuse me. Okay, your shoulder blade. Then your sternal end, that's going to be the pyramidal shaped, all right, or triangular shaped end. And that's going to articulate with the sternum. Okay, so there's a couple structures on here that you need to be familiar with. All right, you've got the conoid tubercle, which you do need to know for identification purposes. The costal tuberosity you do not need to know, all right? But the costal tuberosity is this kind of bump that you'll see on the inferior surface of the clavicle, and there's a muscle there, okay, that attaches it to the first rib. All right? You do need to know the conoid tubercle. So we'll go over this when we're labeling, but if we're looking at the inferior surface, this is the inferior surface here. You got this little bump, all right, and that's going to be closer to the acromial end, that flattened end there. All right, so you can see a little bit better here. All right, that's the conoid tubercle. We'll label it when we go over the slides for identification. Okay, let's talk about the scapula. Okay, the scapula is going to be that triangular flat bone. It's considered an irregular bone, but a good portion of it is flat, right, which makes up our shoulder blade. And it's going to sit on the upper portion of your back superiorly, and then it's going to be lateral because it's going to be further away from the spine. All right. So there's three views here that I want you to be familiar with when we're discussing the scapula. All right, this top view here, that's the lateral view. And this is where your arm or your humerus would be attached. Okay? This is the anterior view. This is the posterior view. Now, that would mean that this is anterior, okay, this way, and this way is posterior. So let's discuss something here, okay? Now, this right here, we'll talk about what that is in a second, but let's just pretend that's not even there. If we were to just get rid of this thing, wouldn't you much rather have this part of the scapula laying on top of your ribs than this part of the scapula laying on top of your ribs with this thing rubbing against your ribs? Wouldn't that hurt? Right? And that's how it's set up, okay? The anterior, this is flat. There's no areas here like this big process that's hanging off. So none of this is going to be rubbing up onto your ribs. So that's why I tell folks, when you look at it first, you know, the anterior view is nice and flat. There's nothing, no protrusions or processes really coming off that's going to rub against the ribs. Here, in the posterior view, you got this big old process coming off, okay? And that can't be the anterior view, because then that would mean that this thing's rubbing on the ribs. And that would hurt. That would feel very uncomfortable. All right. So let's talk about a couple parts to our scapula. All right. So the spine of the scapula sits on the posterior part of the actual scapula, and that was this. That's this thing right here. We'll label it in a second. That's, can't see. That's this guy right here. That's the spine of the scapula. Okay. And that sits on the posterior portion there. At the end of the spine. Okay. When we get to the end of the spine, all right, so the spine goes up and out, and then there's this big structure right there. That's the acromion, okay? And the clavicle will attach onto that, make the acromioclavicular joint, okay? Then we have another process that's going to be more anterior, all right, and that's called the coracoid process. Now, please pay attention to the spelling here, all right? We saw a structure, and I'm not trying to confuse you, earlier this evening called the conoid. That's not really close, but we did see a structure, all right, when we were talking about the axial skeleton. Remember the coronoid process? The coronoid process was on the mandible. Or there was that shark fin structure there, and then you had the mandibular notch, and then you have the condyle here, the mandibular condyle. All right, well, I made that really sharp. It should be more rounded. All right, that was the coronoid process of the mandible. All right, and this is the mandibular notch. All right, well, here we have the coracoid process. All right, and coracobrachialis, one of the muscles, all right, of your arm attaches onto the coracoid process. So note the spelling on that one, okay? All right, just a couple parts to the scapula. Let's talk about the borders of the scapula, all right? And we have 3 of them. It's triangular, okay? So obviously there's only going to be 3 borders since there's only 3 sides. The top border is going to be the superior border. The medial border is going to be the one that's closest to the spine, also known as the vertebral border, all right, but we're not going to be calling it that. And then we have the lateral border, which is going to be closer to the axilla. The axilla is your armpit. So this is the medial border. This is the superior border. And then I'll draw your humerus here, okay? And that makes the armpit right here. So this is the lateral border, okay? All right, so on our scapula, we have some anatomical landmarks that we're going to discuss. On the front portion of the scapula, that big flat region, all right, we refer to that area, all right, because there's a slight depression there, and we have a muscle that's going to sit there. All right, that's known as the subscapular fossa. So, of course, we name the muscle that sits there, which we'll learn later on when we do muscles. That's called subscapularis. That's one of the muscles of your rotator cuff. Has anyone ever heard of the rotator cuff? It's a group of 4 muscles, and it helps to make your shoulder joint stable. Your shoulder joint's a relatively unstable joint, right? And those 4 rotator cuff muscles help to stabilize it. Now, if we flip the scapula over onto the posterior surface, all right, remember the spine of the scapula? Above the spine, we have a little depression. We call that the supra. Remember, supra is above. Spinous fossa. And you have another rotator cuff muscle that sits there called supraspinatus. Below the spine of the scapula, still on the back, all right, we have another depression there, and that's the infraspinous because it's below the spine of the scapula. The muscle that sits there is called infraspinatus. And that's another rotator cuff muscle. Okay, so 3 out of the 4 rotator cuff muscles are immediately associated here with the scapula. Then if you look on the side of the scapula, the lateral side, where the humerus articulates, all right, to make up your shoulder joint, right, we call that the glenoid fossa. So if I'm looking at the scapula, you'll have this depression here on it, and this is the glenoid fossa right there. That's where the head of your humerus sits in. And that makes up your shoulder joint. Actually, it's called the glenohumeral joint. It's the most mobile joint in your body. All right, so if we look here on our pictures, you can see here's the posterior view, here's the anterior view, here's the posterior view. Here's the spine. At the end of the spine is the acromion. Above the spine, supraspinous fossa. That's where supraspinatus sits. Below the spine, infraspinous fossa. That's where infraspinatus sits. Okay, this is where your arm is. Your armpit's going to be here. Here's the lateral border. Here's the medial border. Here's the superior border on top. We go over here to the anterior view, subscapular fossa. Again, medial border. The lateral border, I know because I can see over here. Here's the glenoid fossa right here. That's where your arm's going to be. Then we have our superior border. And then we have this little process coming off. All right, that's the coracoid process. Okay, let's talk about the upper limb. Okay, the upper limb, all right, has several regions. If we go from the shoulder to the elbow, that bone that sits there is the humerus. That region of the upper extremity right here, that's known as the brachium. Okay? We go down to the forearm, you've got 2 bones here in the forearm, the radius and the ulna. All right, this is also known as, this would be considered the arm up here. This is considered the forearm. All right, this is the brachium. This is the antebrachium. Then we get into the wrist. That's made up of 8 bones. Those are called carpal bones. All right, and then we get into the palm and your fingers. We'll talk about those, but those are going to be metacarpals and then phalanges. Yes, ma'am. Yep, it's the same. Yes, ma'am. And you're going to find out when we get into the lower extremity, it's going to be very similar. Okay? When we get here, you look. Femur is one bone in your thigh. Then you get down to the leg here. That's going to be two bones. Okay? And then we'll get down into the foot and toes and all that. But that's for later. Okay. So the components of the upper limb. Okay? So to review, brachium, arm, antebrachium, forearm, then our hand. And then the bones, one humerus in the arm, two bones in the forearm, one radius, one ulna. Our wrist, which is part of the hand, has 8 carpal bones. Then the palm of our hand, we have 5 metacarpal bones. And then you have 14 phalanges in your fingers. Okay? It's a weird number. Okay? You would think that you have 5 fingers and you technically would have 3 bones in each of the fingers. You don't. And your thumb only has 2. So that's why it's only 14 and not 15. Okay? We'll get into that. Let's talk about the humerus. All right, so in the upper extremity is the longest, largest bone there. All right, it will form the glenohumeral joint in your shoulder and the elbow joint in with your radius and ulna. All right, in the forearm there. Here's a nice picture of it. You can see it a couple different angles. This right here is going to be the anterior view of the humerus. This is the posterior view. So when we go over labeling, I know, Candace, this is what you asked me if we're going to understand which is the top, which is the bottom. We'll get there. I promise you, we'll go through it. All right, when we do the identification. I'm going to teach you the tricks of the trade to make sure that you are owning it. Okay, so let's talk about the components of the humerus. Okay, so the humerus is a long bone, which means the long bone is going to have a head. What is the head? That is the proximal epiphysis. The head of the humerus articulates with the scapula in the glenoid cavity. That forms your glenohumeral joint. All right, opposite the head, you have a bump that helps to make up your shoulder. Okay, that is called the greater tubercle. If we go medial to that, that's the lesser tubercle. And then we have, I'll show you. Well, you can't see it. All right, kind of here. We'll go over all this when we do the labeling. All right. So the greater tubercle is over here. The lesser tubercle is over here. Then you got a groove in between. And that's known as the intertubercle fossa or groove. Or you can call it the sulcus too. Okay, not so much a fossa, excuse me, sulcus. All right. So greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, and then the intertubercular sulcus or groove. All right, but what's important about that is it has the long head of the biceps brachii. A lot of times, if people are having shoulder pain, and if they're a very active person, they might have tendinitis. An easy way to do that is to jam your finger in that area and press. Not really hard, because it'll hurt almost anybody. But if they have it, you ask them to flex their shoulder, and they'll jump right out of their chair. And so that's a good sign that they probably have some tendinitis of the biceps there. Okay, you have with the humerus here, here's the head of the humerus. Okay, golly. So you have 2 necks. Normally, the neck of a long bone is the metathesis, where the bone starts to narrow down. But guess what? The humerus is different. Okay, you've got the anatomical neck and the surgical neck. As we know, in the metathesis, that's where the growth plate is for long bones. Okay, so when we're talking about the anatomical neck, all right, that is where the epiphyseal growth plate used to be. That's here. Okay. Oh, sorry, wrong one. Here. So this is, it's weird. The humerus is weird. This is where the growth plate used to be. Then when we start to see the narrowing of the bone, that is the surgical neck. And in most cases, if you're going to fracture your radius, or excuse me, your humerus, that's where it's going to occur. Okay, where it actually starts to narrow down. Then about 1/3 of the way down on the diathesis, we have the deltoid tuberosity. That's where your deltoid muscle attaches. That's going to be your shoulder muscle right here. And then when we get down to the end, all all right, of the humerus, the distal epiphysis, right, you're going to have these little bumps. You ever heard of your funny bone? You bang your elbow, and you're like, ah, dang, that's my funny bone. If you feel it, that's your medial epicondyle. So if you go down by your elbow joint, you'll feel on the inside of your elbow joint that bone sticking out. That is the medial epicondyle. What travels behind the medial epicondyle is the ulnar nerve. That's the nerve when you hit your quote-unquote funny bone, feels all funky. It sits in this groove right behind it. Epicondyles are sites for muscular attachment. You'll have those in the humerus. You'll also see them down in your femur. Okay? But that's where muscles attach onto. All right. At the very end of the humerus, all right, on the distal epiphysis, all right, you have two specially formed or curved surfaces. All right, you have the capitulum and the trochlea. Now, it's important that you understand this. All right, the capitulum is going to articulate with the radius, and the radius is the bone in your forearm that is laterally placed by your thumb. All right, so the capitulum is going to be lateral. The trochlea is going to articulate with the ulna, all right, and that is going to be located medially. Let me show you on this next slide here. All right, first you can see, here's your funny bone or the medial epicondyle. Don't write funny bone, that you'll lose credit. Okay, this is the medial epicondyle. This, by the way, is an anterior view. And when we do the labeling, I'll explain why. Going to the side over here, that's going to be the lateral epicondyle. So you'll see this structure here. This is the radius. This is the ulna. So this structure right here, to me, it looks like a bow tie. It looks kind of like this. Okay? Again, it's tough to see on here. That is going to be the trochlea. And then this rounded ball-like structure, all right, that's the capitulum. And it articulates with the ulna. All right, so those are going to be like the condylar structures that are coming off of the end of the distal epiphysis. So on the distal portion, we have a couple of fossas or depressions that are apparent. On the front side, we've got two, the radial fossa and the coronoid fossa. So the radial fossa, all right, is going to sit above the radius, because when you flex your elbow, all right, the radial head, if you didn't have this fossa available, the radial head would mash into the humerus or press against the humerus. So we have this depression there, so the radial head can settle into that radial fossa, so you can flex your elbow more. Otherwise, you would only be able to flex your elbow about 90 degrees because the radial head would smash into the humerus there. All right. The coronoid fossa, check out the spelling. You saw that before, right? Told you you're going to see it again. All right, we saw it in the mandible. Now we're going to see it here in the humerus. The coronoid fossa is going to be on the medial portion of the forearm, of the humerus, and it is going to articulate, all right, with the ulna. Okay? So again, when you flex your elbow, if that wasn't there, all right, the coronoid process would smash into the humerus. On the back side, all right, again, we're dealing with the ulna. You have this structure. If you feel your elbow, what you're feeling is called the olecranon process. Okay, and it looks something like this. Okay, that's the olecranon process right there. Okay, and the trochlea sits right in here, so it swivels around the trochlea. So when you're touching your elbow, you're feeling this. All right, anyways, when you extend your elbow all the way out, the olecranon process has to settle in to the fossa here. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to straighten your arm all the way out. You'd only be able to straighten it out to about 130, varies, 130, 120 degrees instead of, well, it's almost 180 when you I can't straighten mine out to 180. All right. So again, we need a place for these parts of these articulations to settle into. So that's what we're seeing here. All right. This is an anterior view. This is an anterior view. So here's the radial fossa right above the capitulum here. And then right above the trochlea, you have the coronoid fossa. Then we flip the humerus over, and on the back, you'll see this big depression. That's the olecranon fossa. So part of the olecranon will settle in there. All right, so here you can see how the bones articulate here. All right, we'll see when we label, and I'll show you a quick X-ray here. All right, so you can see this bone right here. This is the ulna. That's your elbow. This is the radius. All right, so let's talk about the forearm here. Okay, the forearm, also known as the antebrachium, is made up of two bones, the radius and the ulna. All right, so when you're in the anatomical position, the radius is going to be the lateral bone, and the ulna is going to be the medial bone. All right, so let's take a look and see what that looks like here. Okay, here is the radius. So this is the anatomical position. Here's the ulna. Now you'll notice you've got this connective tissue in between. That connective tissue helps to create a joint, and it helps to space out the bones so they don't smush into one another. Okay? If it wasn't for this, it's called the interosseous membrane. It allows the bones to pretty much remain parallel to one another. All right, we'll talk about what happens to the bones when you start to twist your arm. Okay, so let's start off with the radius here. All right, at the proximal end of the radius, you've got this disc-shaped head, and we can't see it, but you got this depression at the top of it. Okay, that's where the capitulum sits in from the humerus. All right, so we just refer to that as the head of the radius. And then the bone will start to narrow down a little bit from the head. That's going to be the neck. And then we go down a little bit further, you're going to see this big bump on the front of the bone. And that's where your biceps tendon attaches onto. All right, so you can actually feel your biceps tendon right there in that, it's called the antecubital fossa, right there in your elbow, the front of your elbow. If you flex your arm, you'll feel that tendon. Well, that tendon attaches right there to the radial tuberosity, the biceps brachii. So we go to the far end of the bone, all right, down to the distal end. And you got this, it's a horrible drawing, but deal with it. You'll have this bump, all right, at the distal end here. That's called the styloid process. And then you'll have this little notch here in which the ulna articulates with. And so we call that the ulna notch. That's an awful drawing of the ulna, but you know what I mean. All right. All right. Let's talk about the ulna. All right. The ulna is the larger, or excuse me, the longer of the two. Okay. It's going to make up a significant portion of the elbow, right? Especially on the posterior area there. All right. So when we talk about the ulna, its head, believe it or not, is going to be at the distal end. Okay? So coming off of the head, we have our own styloid process. All right? So if you feel your wrist, you'll feel two bones on either side of your wrist. If you're feeling the bone on your thumb side, that's the styloid process of the radius. If you feel the bone on the pinky side, that's the styloid process of the ulna. Those styloid processes help to keep the carpal bones within the wrist there. Okay? All right, so let's go now to the proximal end. All right, and so we're going to see at the proximal end this C-shaped structure, kind of like what I drew before. Something like that. Okay, this C-shaped structure. Okay, and this is where the trochlea is going to sit. Okay, so what we see around that C-shaped structure, this whole thing, that's the olecranon, also known as the olecranon process. All right, and then this little tip thing down here, That's the coronoid process that is going to approximate with the coronoid fossa on the humerus. Okay? So that coronoid process is this little lip down here. The olecranon will be this whole top portion here. All right? In between the two bones is what I was telling you is the interosseous membrane. Dense regular connective tissue like ligaments and tendons, and it helps to keep, all right, the two bones parallel with one another, but this is the important part. It provides a pivot for rotation of the forearm. It's called supination and pronation. Just this motion here. This is supination when you're in the anatomical position. My palms are facing forward. My forearm is in supination. The forearm bones are parallel. When I do this, when I turn my palms down, what I'm going to show you, the radius is going to cross over the ulna. They're crisscross. So when I'm in supination, they're like this. When I'm in pronation, the radius will cross over. It's cool. I'll show you a picture. All right. So the interosseous membrane here helps to allow for that motion. So here's supination. Palms forward, standing like I'm facing you in the anatomical position. All right. And you can see the two bones here are parallel. Now, when I go into pronation, when I turn my palms over, I turn them down, look at the radius. It crossed right over. Okay? That's called pronation. Okay. I'm going to stop with the lecture portion here. And now let's just do some labeling with the axial skeleton, and then we'll call it a night. Okay? This is a good place to stop. This is where I usually stop anyways. All right, so if you have your atlas handy, we're just going to, I don't want to say fly through these, but we're just going to move through these to make sure everything's labeled so you're going to be well prepared for the test. Okay. So we're going to start in the cervical spine, all right, with one of our atypical vertebrae, okay? So, and I did tell you guys, I know I told the other section, and you were listening, but I'm just going to remind everybody, and for you at home, again, we'll remind you too. On your lab test, you need to know which region of the spine these vertebrae are found. Those are two-part questions. I'm telling you this right now, okay? So if this goes up there, and it's pointing, all right, let me show you this one. I'll come back to this slide. If you see this slide up there, it'll have arrows pointing to these structures here. And it'll say, identify the structure, in what region of the spine will you find this vertebrae? So it's a two-parter. So you will, of course, say lateral masses, and then you look at this, you're like, well, that's the atlas, so it's in the cervical spine. Your answer will be cervical, okay? So you need to know that, all right? So here again, you can either use C1 or atlas to name this vertebrae. Okay, it's the first one. All right, here are the lateral masses. What are these? There you go, transverse foramen. This is what? You said it the first time. Yeah, that's the transverse process. Yep, good. Okay, transverse foramen, whole. Transverse process is the bony projection coming off to the side. Okay, what's this hole right here? Yep, vertebral foramen. That's it. That is it. Okay, these are lateral masses. These are not articular processes. They are not articular facets. They're lateral masses. Okay, you don't have this in your lab book, but this is just showing you the odontoid process or the dens. I'll show it on a different model here. This is C2 or the axis, if we're asking to identify the vertebrae. Second cervical vertebrae, right? All right, so here's the dens or the odontoid process from the other angle. Okay? This right here, I don't like this one. Hold on. Let me use this one. It's a little bit easier to see. This right here is a superior articular process. The flat surface is going to be the facet, but this whole structure is a superior articular process. Okay? All right. Good example. This is a great example for a bifid or a bifurcated spinous. See those two little nubbins there? Boom and boom. Okay? And then you can see the relationship between the atlas on the axis here. Okay? How the odontoid or dens sits tucked behind the anterior portion here of C1. And then there's a ligament that wraps around the back here, the transverse ligament. Okay, let's move into what you're going to find on all the other vertebrae. Okay, what we call a typical vertebrae. Okay, so you're going to see all this. So all this should be labeled. All right, so obviously the vertebral body. Then we've got the spinous process in the back. You've got the transverse processes coming off to the side. All right, then right here you've got the vertebral foramen, the big hole in the middle. So the bone that is going to not articulate, but that is on the posterior portion of the body, of the vertebral body, this right here, that's the pedicle. All right, and then the smooth portion of this structure here is the facet. The facet sits on an articular process. Okay? Oh, and I didn't say the lamina. Okay, the lamina is going to be found between the transverse process and the spinous process. Okay, it's going to make up the posterior lateral border of the vertebral canal. The body makes up the anterior border of the vertebral canal, and the pedicles make up the lateral portion of the vertebral canal. Okay, so you need to know this on all of them, on all the typical cervical vertebrae, on all the typical thoracic vertebrae, and lumbar. Speaking of, look at this slide here. You should be able to identify. Easy, don't miss this. Look to see, all right, if the vertebrae has transverse foramen. If it has transverse foramen, those are only found in the cervical vertebrae. That's it, okay? So if this is up there and you don't see transverse foramen, the transverse process here, that can't be a cervical vertebrae. And look at the size of the body here of the lumbar vertebrae. It's huge. Huge compared to these little guys. Okay? So if it's huge vertebral body, it's lumbar. So that's the first two things that I would look for. Vertebral body is big. All right, no. Okay, so it's either thoracic or cervical. All right, do I see transverse foramen? No, it's thoracic. Boom. There's half your credit right there. Okay? All right. Here's the vertebral body for C2 or the axis. Sits right, that's what the dens sits on top of. Okay? It sits right on top of that. Here you can see it from the lateral view. Okay, there's the cervical, the vertebral body for the cervical vertebrae. And here we'll see it from the superior view. All right, we're gonna roll through all the different vertebral bodies here. All right, so here's the cervical, here's the thoracic, vertebral body for the thoracic. Here it is for the lumbar. You don't have this, okay? And then here it is superior view. Again, look at the size of that body. And then here it is from the lateral view. Okay, feel pretty good about that one? Everybody should get that. Vertebral body.
On the lab test, are you going to have like both pictures?
It'll just be one. Yep, it'll be one view.
One of this, or like it'll be like this, or is it going to be picture this, or picture this?
It'll be what you see on the screen right here. It'll just be this. Yep, it won't have both.
But there's the potential of.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, yeah. Yep. Either or. Either or. Yeah, it could be either this or it could be this. Yep. All right. There's that vertebral arch. Remember. So you have the vertebral body, and then the part of the spine comes all the way here to here. That's the vertebral arch.
Are these ones you said earlier within the region?
That was in.
That's not region.
All right. If it comes back to you, let me know. All All right, but the vertebral body is made up of, the vertebral arch is made up of the pedicles, okay, here, and the lamina here, okay? And where the lamina fuse together, that's where the spinous process comes from. All right, but just keep in mind that's the vertebral arch. So on the test, if you see, all right, this dotted line going here, that's what they're referring. That's what they want. All right, the vertebral arch. Here you can see it in the thoracic vertebrae. I don't know why the lines aren't going all the way up to the vertebral body, but you'll see it better here in the lumbar vertebrae. Vertebral arch, yes, ma'am. Pretty much everything except for the body, so just extend that whole area from the body all the way down around to the other side of the body. Okay, so here's a couple examples of the vertebral foramen. All right, here it is in the cervical spine. This should be easy. It's an individual vertebra, then it's the vertebral foramen. If it's a whole bunch of them stacked on top of one another, then it's the vertebral canal. Okay? Here it is here in the thoracic vertebrae. Here it is here in the lumbar. All right, so now let's look at the transverse processes, okay? These guys that are coming off. We'll go up here and show you on C1. There's the transverse process of C1, coming right off the side there. All right, and I'll actually show you one for C2. All right, it's coming off here. Can't see it on the other side. But again, if you look for the transverse foramen, all right, it's going to be that portion of the bone that's further lateral or inferior from the transverse foramen. All right, typical cervical vertebrae, there it is. Here, here. And then you can see the transverse process here from the posterior view of a thoracic vertebrae. You don't have this one in your book, but you do have this one. There's the lateral view of the transverse process. Well, like I said, they'll usually ask you what region of the spine, so you'll have to. But if you were to put transverse process, I won't mark you wrong, because you'll have to identify the region. There's the there's the transverse process here. Superior view of the thoracic vertebrae, and then you can see the superior view here of the lumbar vertebrae. All right, then you'll have it here on the lateral view. Okay, so you can see it's outlined. It's tough to see, but it's projecting out at us from the screen. Okay, transverse foramen. There it is on C1. There it is on C2. Okay, quick review now. Ready? Articular facets and articular processes. All right, so the whole bony projection is going to be the process. If it's above the vertebrae, it's the superior one. If it's below, it's inferior. And then the flat surface that is going to articulate with another vertebrae or another bone is going to be the articular facet. So here, all right, this is pointing to the superior articular process, but it is the flat surface. So if you wrote on there articular facet, you're not wrong. Okay? The whole thing here, this whole thing is the process. But that flattened surface. So just see how it's worded. If there's any wording on it. If you put facet and there's no wording on there, then I won't mark you wrong, because you're pointing to the articular facet. All right. Same thing with this one. This is more towards the whole process right here. And for good measure, we'll throw in transverse foramen for your cervical. Make sure you got that for a typical. And then you can see, again, here, this is pointing to the facet joint space. All right, so again, the whole structure right here is the superior articular process, but it's also pointing to the facet. So at that point, it's your choice. All right, here we
Say
can.
our choice, would you use either one of them?
I won't mark you wrong. The computer may, but like I said, it's the same. I mean, it's all dependent on the arrow placement. If the arrow is, if it's on this side, if it's pointing here, then that's definitely process. Okay, because that's the smooth flat area. Okay, scary. All right. So that's the thing. It all depends on the arrow placement. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, it's pointing to the same thing, then you're not going to be wrong if you put down facet or process. Okay, as long as it's a flat, smooth area on the process. Just make sure there's no words on the slide that it's asking you for a specific answer, because sometimes we will prompt you for the specific answer. All right, so like this one, for example, this is definitely the superior articular process because the facet's on the other side of this process. It's more internal. All right, here, not the best version. You don't have this in your book, so you don't have to worry about it. But this one here, again, this is the inferior articular process, but it's also pointing to the facet. This one's definitely pointing to the process because you can't see the facet smooth area there. And then here is the lumbar. Okay, so let's talk about bifurcated or bifid spinous. That's right there. Again, you can see it's got these two little bumps on the bottom of it. If it was just straight back, one single thing, then that's not a bifurcated spinous or bifid spinous. That is a spinous process. All right, like this one here. I don't like, oh, you don't have that in your book, so I'm not worried about that. There's a good spinous process. Here's an even better one, laterally. Okay, I wouldn't be able to tell if that was a bifid spinous process because I can't see the other side. So I couldn't ask you that. All right, here's a nice view of the spinous process. And then you can see it from the lateral view here. And then we'll drop down into the lumbar. And you can see the lateral view here of the spinous process in the lumbar. See how short it is? It's kind of blunted. It's thick. It's wide, but again. And then you can see it, boom, right here from the superior view. All right. Again, you don't have this in your book, but this is just a reminder. If we stack the vertebrae on top of one another, it will create the foramen here, where the spinal nerves can exit out. So it's right behind the disc. Okay? So if I go up to right here, there you go. All right. Anatomically, when the vertebrae is by itself, this area here is really nothing. But if I stack another vertebrae below it, like here's the disc, and then here's the body of the next lumbar vertebrae, all right, and then you'll have the other spinous process articulating with this area. Not spinous process, superior articulating process. All right, you've now created this space in here in which the spinal nerve exits out. And that's what we're seeing here. Whoops. That's what we're seeing here. Okay, so that's the intervertebral foramen, which sits behind the intervertebral disc. Okay, almost done. Let's go into the sacrum here. All right, this is a picture of the sacrum. This is an anterior view of the sacrum. This is a posterior view of the sacrum. Here's the sacrum again, all by itself. Okay. So on the corners of the sacrum, near the superior portion, that's the sacral ala, or ala, right here and here. I know on the other slide show when I was showing you the foramina here, okay? You can write in there the anterior sacral foramina, okay, or the posterior, well, that's an anterior view. So don't put posterior sacral foramina, you get it wrong. But if you just put sacral foramina, that's usually good enough for me. And then here's a lateral view of the sacrum. And again, I told you this before, this is where the sacrum articulates with your hip bones. So when you have your hip bones attached to the sacrum, you can't see this because this is in the joint space. But that surface there is called the auricular surface. And you can kind of see it here, all right, on this view. All right, the last part of the spine, coccyx, your tailbone. Okay, let's do the ribs and your sternum. Okay, the sternum has three parts to it. This top superior part to it is the manubrium. Okay, your first rib attaches on there, part of your second rib, and then your clavicles. Okay, now we'll see it here in the whole thorax, the chest there. All right, on top there, you've got this little indentation here. That's the jugular notch or suprasternal notch. In some cases, it's been known as the sternal notch. All right, but that's that space that sits in between. You can see it here. It sits in between the two clavicles. Okay, that little indentation there. Okay, right below the manubrium, the long, skinny part of your breastbone, that's the body. All right, and then you can see it here. Here's the body. And this is where you're going to get, all right, part of rib 2, all right, through 7 will attach, or the costal cartilage, I should say, of those ribs will attach directly onto the sternum. And then at the bottom of your sternum, that's going to be your xiphoid process, that little extension coming off the bottom. All right, and then you can see it here. So that's the third part of the sternum. All right, so that's it for the sternum. Right, last part, ribs. Here we go. Okay. So first off, right, obviously this whole bone's a rib. So the ribs attach to two areas, unless your ribs 11 and 12. All right, they'll attach onto the vertebra, and then they'll attach onto the sternum via the cartilage. Okay, so the end that's more flat, okay, where the cartilage will be, that's the sternal end. I can almost guarantee you'll have a question on this. Don't put rib. All right, look to see. It'll ask you, what end is this? And then at the other end, all right, where all the stuff is, this knobby structure, that's the vertebral end, right here. Okay, so now look at this slide here, all right? The arrow will not change as I advance the slide. It's the same exact slide, but notice the words do, okay? So the specific area, this specific structure is the head. So if there's no words on the slide, say head, okay? The only time you'll say the vertebral end is if it says, which end of the rib is this? What region is this, okay? Otherwise, if there's no words on it, you're going to say head, okay? Then, as we move down the rib here, it's going to get a little bit skinny here. That's the neck. All right, the neck does not articulate with anything. It doesn't touch anything. The head articulates with the vertebra, the vertebral bodies. Then this little bump here, okay, that's the costal tubercle. That's going to articulate with the transverse process of that thoracic vertebrae. All right, good so far? Almost done.
Ask questions, like,
Yeah, sorry.
are you going to ask questions like where something articulates to?
Like, oh, like what part articulate? No, no, not so much. No, when I say not so much, I've never really asked that. Okay, so let's just review the true versus false ribs, and then we're out of here. Okay, so ribs 1 through 7 are what we call true ribs, okay, or vertebral sternal ribs. That means they originate on the thoracic vertebra, the spine, hence vertebral, and then their costal cartilage is going to insert onto the sternum. So hence vertebral sternal ribs or true ribs. That's ribs 1 through 7. Now I can almost guarantee you will see this again, this specific slide here. All right, it'll have an arrow pointing, all right, usually to either these 2 ribs or these bottom 3 ribs here. Or actually, that would be these 3, but these 3 right here. Okay, so let's review. False ribs are going to be 8 through 12. Okay, that means that they don't directly attach to the sternum. Yes, either will be okay. If you want to use true or false, unless it tells you not to use one term or the other. But yes, I don't have a problem if you're using false or the vertebral chondral or the vertebral. Because it might ask you another way. I've seen that on the test where it will ask you, what's another way of saying true rib? And then you would have to say vertebral sternal. Okay? What'd you say? I usually start, it's tough to see here. I'll start from the bottom. It's just easier that way. So 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, I mean, you can actually see rib 1 pretty decent here. On some models I've seen it's tough to see. So wherever I can get a definitive starting point, I'll go with. But on the anterior view, I'll start with rib 1, which is, it's tough to see, but you can see it. I can't see 12 and 11 clearly, but here I can see the costal cartilage here of rib 1. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8, 9, and 10. And then you can, again, this is 11 and 12 back and through here. It's tough to see. So 8 through 12, okay, false ribs, okay, but their costal cartilage is going to attach onto the costal cartilage of rib 7. So we call those vertebral chondral, chondral being cartilage. So it originates on the vertebrae, then it inserts onto the costal cartilage of rib 7. And then the last 2 are the floating ribs. Okay, they're still false, all right, except they don't attach onto anything other than the vertebrae. So they're just called the vertebral ribs. So you can call them floating ribs or you can call them vertebral ribs. They don't have cartilage. They're just out there in space. So you should be able to see, all that should be labeled there for you. Sternal end, vertebral end, that's where you'll find the rib head, the rib neck, all that. And that's it. That's it. The axial skeleton is done. Okay. So we did good. Look at that. We still have time. So I can let you folks out a little bit early. Any questions for me? All right. As of right now, you have all the axial skeleton labeled. When we come back to class on Tuesday, we'll label the upper extremity, and we'll finish up some of that lecture-like material. Yes, ma'am.
Are you going to post this on
Oh yeah.
my email?
Oh yeah. Yep. I'll email it to you, and then I'll post it on my YouTube channel. Pardon? No, we will. We'll do that. We'll do. Yeah, no. I just went over some of the parts and pieces, but yeah, we'll label that first thing. All right. Anybody at home? Any questions, concerns? So after Tuesday, we will have everything. No. After Tuesday, well, right now you have everything for the axial skeleton. after Tuesday, Thursday, you will have everything for the test. So Thursday, we'll have all the remaining items labeled in your atlas. You got it. All right. Well, that's no more questions. Everybody have a good night. Have a good weekend. All right, I am going to stop recording, so it's going to crash.